Welcome to this second part of section 2 of the limited online lectures in beef cattle breeding. As I've said in the previous part, this is more on practical breeding, breeding objectives, selection, ways of selecting animals, and so forth. And I would also like to remind you that it's extremely important that you first finish the first part, the first section of this course before you proceed with these lectures, these second series of lectures. This part is very interesting. Although we dealt with breeding value predictions, genetic merit, all aspects of genetic merit prediction and breeding objectives, it's also important to also take into consideration that functional appearance or functional efficiency also forms an extremely important part of the selection of even production animals. And therefore, this part is then included in these lectures. It's a brief overview of functional efficiency. It's not an in-depth course in functional efficiency in beef cattle. But it's as important as the parts on genetic merit predictions of production traits. So maybe just some broad background. A lot of work has been done in the previous century on the animal and its response on the environment, especially in the South African case, the subtropical environment, and the indigenous animals, the Sangha types of animals, and how they are adapted to the climatic conditions and production systems, and also the vegetation in terms of grass cover and the type of grasses and the heat increment caused by the digestion of those grasses. So Professor Bonsma has done a lot of work, and it's been published, and it actually took the world by storm when the Zebu types were also became very popular, and later on it was discovered that we also talk about an African Sangha type, Bostaurus africanus, which is the type of animals in South Africa. And that also coined the phrase of cattle to be maybe separated into two separate entities, if you can call it that, namely the metabolic type and the respiratory type of cattle. Now, obviously, the two extremes are being mentioned here, but they're also everything in between. So, if one just looks at the extremes, the respiratory type, or the type of animals the cattle that are better adapted to subtropical environments and better adaptation to heat. They're usually smaller framed, they usually have a looser skin to get rid of the excess of heat. They usually have a lower metabolism, not to keep the heat increment down and not generate too much heat in the digestion process. They are usually effective sweaters. They get rid of the excessive heat more efficiently. And they usually have a shorter digestive tract, and that also equates to the less heat generated. And you will also see that the way that they are, the way they look and they form, there are differences in the rib cartilage, and they usually have relative to body size, they have more extremes and be able to get rid of heat. Whereas the metabolic type, and that would be our usually European or British developed type of breeds, they're usually in a block form, not necessarily, but closer to a block form. They usually have tighter skins. They have a faster metabolism, which generates more heat, and obviously they grow better and they perform. They very, especially when you don't have feed with high heat increments and that digest easily. they usually perform in those conditions, and they usually have a longer digestive tract. So those are the two extremes. Obviously, most cattle will fit somewhere in between those two extremes, and not necessarily you're not necessarily be able to classify cattle in one category or the other. It's somewhere in the middle. And obviously, those cattle that were later on formed through the mating of different types of cattle. The composite breeds will also fit somewhere in between these two extremes. Just generally, in terms of functional cattle, the ability to be functional is very important, and obviously functionality will also be a function of the production system and the environment where you have to produce beef. So it can differ between environments, and it can differ between production systems and the availability of feed. So how do we know that animals are well adapted? We usually know that they are able to reproduce, and they are able to find food and feed in the production system, and they will be able to grow, and they have good muscling for beef production. It's interesting, if you read the books of Professor Bonsma, you will say that he concluded that those animals that are best adapted will also grow better, especially pre-weaning growth. So those cows would be adapted to the environment. They will be able to tolerate the heat. They will be able to tolerate the external parasites, and they will look after their calves. And due to that, their calves will grow better, and they will be better adapted. But the real test would be in terms of reproduction, whether they reconceive or not. And then obviously, where you have high heat loads and you have high ultraviolet radiation, pigment and coat is also very important. Are these animals well adapted in terms of being good, well pigmented, and able to tolerate the high UV rays of the sun? Then also, like I said, heat production is also important. Although cattle can differ in terms of getting rid of excess heat to keep their body temperature, the heat production is also important. If it's an effort for them to walk, if it's an effort for them to digest the lignin-rich grasses that you get in subtropical areas, then it's also a problem. Obviously, in terms of adaptations, in many cases, even where you have warm summers, you can have cold winters, and that is also the ability to adapt to that. In terms of adaptation, one can also see adaptation well in terms of hormonal balance, especially with something like a sleek coat, early shedding of hair when the season changes towards summer or spring. Usually they are your more adapted animals. They shed their winter hair quicker than the others, and they are usually better adapted, and it's also part of the hormonal balance in terms of that. And obviously, like I alluded, reproduction status. So those are general things about adaptation, but also equally important would be that those animals need to be free from structural and restricting conformational faults. Will a bull be able to serve cows? Would these form and function also reflect that? Would a cow calve easily? Will she be able to walk to water, and so forth and so forth? So one of the important parts would also be to talk a little bit about the energy cycle in cattle. We deal with ruminants, so obviously it's because it's a ruminant, the available energy that's available to the cow would be through her feed intake, her body reserves that she can actually utilize, let's say fat deposition in the channel fat around the organs, but even subcutaneous fat under the skin, which would be a last resort, would then be utilized in terms of energy. But because it's a ruminant, you can also recycle some of the nutrients that she needs. So of the available energy, some obviously the first choice of available energy will go to the essential processes to keep her alive, to keep her body temperature, and so forth. So our own maintenance, generation of heat, then there will be gas that's a byproduct of this whole process. Obviously urine and manure that comes off, and some of the metabolic all the metabolic processes in the body needs to be maintained. So the first channel of energy will always be to the essential processes before the so-called optional processes or the production processes can lay claim on the availability of energy in terms of let's say our production cow, because that's our most important animal on the farm. So and between or amongst these production channels, obviously there will be growth, there will be finishing or carcass finishing, fat deposition, reproduction, and milk production. So obviously if the availability of energy is limited, then there will be a limited amount of energy being channeled to the optional processes or the production processes, and then the first thing that will actually show this would be the reproduction rate, and then the others. But a more adaptable animal to the environment will need less energy in terms of the essential processes, because they don't have to put an extra effort into being able to survive, and that would then have more energy available for the production processes. So though in principle, when we select for all these traits, or this is a trait group, it means that those animals that do better in these trait groups are obviously better adapted, because they are able to reduce the energy needed for these processes here. Lower maintenance animals, better heat tolerant in terms of heat production, and the rest of these metabolic processes are more efficient. So by drafting a selection index, including all these processes, we also end up with more efficient animals in a specific environment. If we therefore talk about functionality, one can also then say that it's like someone standing on two pillars. The one in terms of functionality, the one would be the genetic merit, and here we're talking about the combination of traits or properties that makes part of your trait definition or your objective breeding objectives. You have to have the goals, and then the other leg would be on the visual assessment of the animal, and that's all about functional efficiency. So and these two pillars are equally important when in the selection of beef cattle. So obviously you have to define your traits very well. You have to observe whatever you want to select for very well and as objective as possible. And you have to do recordings. It's no use trying to just remember. Do a proper analysis of what's available to you, and obviously test animals against these goals that you've set for yourself. So let's just then look at some aspects of functionality in terms of bulls and cows. The first one obviously would be that you don't want to breed animals with anatomical errors or mistakes in the way that they are formed, and one can also talk about maleness and femaleness. So the extremes are true in terms of a male being overly male and a female being feminine as well. So this can be determined by visual features, but also behavioral differences amongst animals, and it's usually a good reflection of a healthy hormone balance in these animals. So just look at something like a functional bull, and these are just general observations, and like I've said earlier on, this is not an in-depth course in functionality and functional efficiency or breed characteristics. This is just to put the record straight and to have a balance in terms of selection of beef cattle. So obviously a bull, there are three aspects of a bull that's important. The one is his libido, or willingness to serve cows. and is wide and he's awake and he observes cows that are on heat. So that's the one part. The second part would be the quality of his semen and whether he's really fertile, and the quantity and quality of semen and his ability to actually be able to create progeny in the process. So that's the second one. The third part then would be his ability to serve and to walk and to be adapted to the specific environment that he has to do his job. So that's not anatomy of this bull, where the scrotum and the testis conformation, the penis conformation, and so forth. So those would be the genitalia, the sheath, the formation of the sheath, the anatomy of the sheath, the sphincter muscles, etc. So those would be part of it. But also in terms of hind legs, he has to work on his hind legs when he serves cows. So that would also be important. And then generally, how well is he adapted? Does he have a smooth coat? Can he handle the external parasites? Can he handle the high UV rays of the sun? Can he dispose of extra heat, or does he, and his ability to walk, etc. So those would be the important parts. Also, generally spoken, usually a bull would show masculinity in the front quarters. You usually have well developed muscles in the front quarters. So he's heavier on this side. He usually doesn't show excess fat in the brisket, loose dewlap. Excess skin is a good thing where you are in warmer climates and you have to get rid of the extra heat. Good sweating ability, and so forth. So this is then a specimen or an example of a well-structured bull that we can say probably will be functionally efficient in terms of the job he needs to do. Just then to look at some of the deviations that you never want in a bull. This is where you have an undeveloped testicle on the unilateral underdeveloped hyperplasia, which is extremely bad. And here you can see some other deviations, such as the twisted testicle within the scrotum. That is also an unwanted feature, and also very hairy scrotal sac can lead to a detriment in terms of heat, getting rid of heat. You know that you have a whole complex, a pampiniform complex in the neck of the scrotum that's supposed to cool down arterial blood coming from the body into the testis, where you have a heat increment between the body and the testis of about 3 or 4 or 5 degrees centigrade, depending on the heat outside. And the ability of this bull to pull up the testis close to the body when he needs to be warmer, and to also let them hang looser in terms of heat dispensation. So these are some aspects that's very important. Just this picture of the bull on the left, although these testes don't look too bad in terms of the scrotum as well, we can see how post-legged this bull is, very straight hocks, and probably won't be able to walk well and won't be able to serve the cows that he needs to serve. Another important factor is the sheath and the navel skin on the navel is another example of a young calf. If you have excess navel, you see that the angle of the sheath physically goes down, and then also the ability to actually pull up the sheath close to the body if need to be, and then also the opening at the end of the sheath. There's a little sphincter muscle there, and animals differ in terms of their ability to actually pull that muscle and to close the sphincter. So especially where you have long grass, tall grass, and they can actually lead to situations where you have some infections and so forth in the sheath end, and also prolapse of the sheath could also be a problem if there's no control over that. So this is very important. You can even see these loose navels in cows, and the resultant progeny, bull progeny of those calves can have the same type of problem. If we look at cows, if you remember the bull that we looked at previously, you remember that he was very well developed in the forequarters. With the cow, you have a very nice triangular shape from front to back. That's important, and if you were to look at her from the top down, if she walked underneath you and you were high on a plank, on a vantage point, you will also see a triangle, from a shoulder blades to a hip bones, in a triangle to the back. So obviously feminine, very softer in the neck, no overly muscle development here. Also a very loose dewlap, no excess fat deposition in the brisket. Very well developed udder with nice teats that the calf can actually drink milk from and not battle in that process. And we'll talk a little bit about the hip, thole and pin bone angle. That's important. So you want a sloping rump from the back as well as from the side, sloping a little bit downwards from the hip bone to the pin, and if you stand behind her, from the top of the back to the thole as well. Okay, so functional udders, obviously this is typically good functional udders, small teats, functional. This is not bad as yet, but this can develop if the udders are or the teats are very thick, and it ends up in something like a bottle teat. Then you can have huge problems in terms of especially the newborn calf's ability to get milk from its mother. This is just again what I've mentioned earlier in terms of the pelvis formation and the ease of calving. So obviously this is then the hip bone and the pin and the thole, and you will see you want that sort of slopey rump, and also this angle between the two needs to be there. As soon as the thole pushes up, and this angle becomes bigger, then those cows usually have a problem in terms of their ability to calve easily. So these are just some of the functionalities that any breeder should be aware of. Even a buyer of bulls from the seed stock industry need to take that into consideration. Okay, here are some extremes. Here you have a functional bull and cow at the top, the ones that we just looked at, and these are some of the extremes one sometimes come across. This is actually a female. You can see she has an udder with teats, but you can see she has this muscular development in the front quarters, just like a bull. That means she's either infertile or subfertile. She would not calve, or she shows all the signs of an infertile type of animal. So these are the telltale signs. And if you look at this bull, much more feminine, less muscle development in the forequarters, and also his masculinity is something that lacks. So there are some other anatomical traits that can also contribute to functionality, and some unwanted traits that you have to cull for. One is double muscling. Obviously now with the test we can determine carriers of different forms of double muscling, but especially in the production systems in South Africa, double muscling is something not to be tolerated, I think. Mouth, head and jaw disorders, legs and claws and walking ability is very important, especially where you have natural pastures and felt. And then obviously I've mentioned skin coat and pigment are important. Then you can have some unwanted traits. So it's also sometimes a matter of how much emphasis can be put on some of these traits. So some of the unwanted traits where you can discriminate against are poor back and sides, maybe poor muscling or a little bit of lack of muscling, especially on the male side. I would certainly not concentrate on muscling on the female side, and there might be other unwanted traits also that you have to discriminate against. Just to come back to mouth, nose and jaw problems, on the right hand side here is a very good example of a cow and a calf, and you can clearly see the skew nose. So usually these anatomical traits are highly heritable, and what you see in the parents usually reflect in the offspring as well. So this is a skew face, and it can also be a twisted face sometimes. This is a good example of an undershot jaw. Obviously, the best way of dealing with that is to get the animal in the crush, open up the lips and see if it bites nicely in terms of the jaw. Wolfson laminitis, this is also very important in terms of walking ability and so forth. There's a tendency in certain animals to have overgrown claws and also the laminae, the top edge here of the hoof where the new hoof is formed or the claws are formed. If they get infected, it's extremely painful, and that could also make it an animal not non-functional anymore. So very well formed claws, equal in size, and not growing excessively is what one would like in your breeding animals. These are just also some examples in terms of heels. The pasterns, where you have loose pasterns, and sometimes also with cow-hocked or sickle-hocked type of animals and loose pasterns, and at least this angle is sometimes not nice, 45 degrees or whatever. You also get grown hoofs because they tend to walk on the back part of the hoof. This is an example of a post-legged animal with very straight hocks. Usually these animals have a huge problem in terms of walking ability, and if it's a bull, serving ability as well. So this is possibly more unwanted than the one on the left, where you have some degree of sickle or even cow hocked hocks. Okay, this was just a brief description of some of the functional traits that's usually observed with the eye, and where you have animals walking about and looking at the way that they behave and how they deal with it. Also, maybe in certain cases where you physically have to examine them in terms of the size and the equalness or the symmetry of the testes, where you have to palpate them. Also, the measurement of that is very important, because testis size relates to actually testis weight relates to semen volume, but also then testis volume relates to semen volume, and some other traits and properties. Generally spoken, we said that this is equally as important as the blood breeding values for the production traits, and production in a broad sense that includes reproduction, and therefore we see this as the two pillars that breeding and selection should be based on.